Many Christians still believe that nothing truly catastrophic could ever happen to their nation because God would never allow it. But that comforting sentence repeated in churches, whispered in conversations, clung to like a shield, could not be farther from the truth. My name is Amanda Larson, and I never imagined that my lifelong passion for understanding the earth was quietly preparing me for the revelation I'm about to share. I've spent 23 years as a geologist, tracing fault lines across deserts and coastlines, decoding tectonic movements, and studying the silent pressures that twist and reshape the planet beneath us. I've devoted entire nights to analyzing seismic patterns, drilling into ancient layers of stone, and trying to forecast where the next rupture might unfold. I thought I understood the ground we all walk on. I thought science had given me the tools to read the earth like a map. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in my academic training or professional experience could have prepared me for what took place on November 10th, 2025. That day shattered everything I believed about the natural world and opened a door into a realm I never knew was real. That morning started like any other day in my life as a researcher at the United States Geological Survey. I was driving to a field site in Northern California, about 40 m east of San Francisco, where we had detected some unusual seismic activity over the past few weeks. The readings were unlike anything I had seen in my career, and I was eager to collect soil samples and take measurements that might explain what was happening deep beneath the surface. The mountain road was winding and steep, carved into the hillside decades ago when safety standards were far less stringent than they are today. I remember thinking about the irony of a geologist driving on such an unstable section of highway, especially given all the recent seismic activity in the region. The morning fog was particularly thick that day, reducing visibility to maybe 30 ft ahead of my vehicle. I was listening to a podcast about recent volcanic activity in Iceland when I noticed my car starting to shake. At first, I thought it might be engine trouble, but then I realized the shaking was coming from the ground itself. The earthquake hit with a violence I had never experienced, even after decades of studying them. The road began to crack and buckle beneath my tires, and I could hear the terrible sound of rock and earth shifting all around me. What happened next occurred so quickly that I barely had time to process it. A massive section of the hillside above the road gave way, sending tons of rock and debris cascading down. The last thing I remember was seeing an enormous boulder, probably weighing several tons, tumbling directly toward my windshield. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. One moment I was gripping the steering wheel, trying desperately to navigate through the chaos, and the next moment I felt myself lifting away from the wreckage. There was no pain, no struggle, just a strange sensation of floating upward while watching my crushed vehicle disappear beneath tons of rubble far below. I could see my own body trapped inside, motionless and broken, and I understood with perfect clarity that I had died. But instead of darkness or fear, I was surrounded by the most incredible light I had ever witnessed. This wasn't the harsh glare of the sun or the artificial brightness of laboratory equipment. This light was warm and alive, pulsing with a love so pure and complete that it seemed to penetrate every part of my being. As I moved toward this light, I heard a voice that made my soul tremble with recognition and awe. "Amanda," the voice said, and immediately I knew I was in the presence of Jesus Christ himself. Though the brilliance surrounding him made it difficult to see his features clearly at first, his presence was unmistakable. Every fiber of my spiritual being responded to his authority, his love, his infinite compassion. When my eyes finally adjusted to the glory around him, I could see his face, and his eyes held depths of wisdom that seemed to contain the answers to every question I had ever asked about the earth. About life, about eternity itself. "My daughter," he said, his voice resonating through dimensions I never knew existed. "I have brought you here because there is something my people must understand about what is coming to the land you have studied so faithfully. Your knowledge of the earth's structure has prepared you to comprehend what I am about to reveal. A great shaking is coming to America, one that will reshape not only the physical landscape, but the spiritual landscape of the nation." I found myself able to speak, though not with physical words. "Lord," I whispered, "why are you showing this to me? I'm just a scientist. I study rocks and fault lines. Who would believe what a geologist has to say about spiritual matters?" His smile was gentle, but filled with divine purpose. "I have always used those who understand my creation to speak to my people about my plans. The earth itself declares my glory, and those who have spent their lives studying it are uniquely equipped to recognize my hand in the events that are about to unfold. Your scientific background will help people understand that what they are about to witness is not random disaster, but divine intervention." Suddenly, we were no longer in that brilliant space, but standing on what appeared to be a vast observation point high above the North American continent. I could see the entire United States spread out below us like a living map. And somehow, I understood that we were witnessing events that would begin to unfold in the coming months. "Watch carefully," Jesus instructed, "and observe how I will use the very foundations of the earth to accomplish my purposes. The shaking that is coming will not be random or accidental. Every tremor, every shift in the ground, every movement of rock and soil will be precisely orchestrated to fulfill prophecies spoken long ago." As I watched, the continent below us began to change. I could see lines of stress appearing across the landscape like cracks in glass, following patterns that my trained eye recognized as major fault systems. But these weren't the familiar fault lines I had studied for decades. These were new fractures appearing with supernatural precision across regions that had been geologically stable for millions of years. The first major event I witnessed was centered in California, but it was unlike any earthquake I had ever studied or imagined. The San Andreas Fault System, which I had spent years researching, began to move with unprecedented violence. But this wasn't just one earthquake. It was a cascade of seismic events, each one triggering the next, creating a chain reaction that spread across the entire western coast. I watched in awe and terror as Los Angeles disappeared beneath massive fissures that opened in the earth. The Pacific Ocean rushed inland through new channels carved by the shifting ground, transforming the geography of Southern California beyond recognition. San Francisco suffered a similar fate, with the famous bay expanding dramatically as sections of the coast simply vanished beneath the waves. "But Lord," I said, my scientific mind struggling to process what I was seeing, "the geological forces required to cause this level of destruction would be absolutely massive. The energy release would be equivalent to hundreds of the largest earthquakes ever recorded happening simultaneously." "Precisely," Jesus replied, his voice carrying both sorrow and determination. "This is not the result of natural tectonic processes alone. This is my hand moving upon the earth using the very systems I created to accomplish my purposes. The wickedness in these regions has reached a level that demands judgment, just as it did in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah." The vision continued, showing me the cascade of destruction spreading eastward across the continent. The Yellowstone volcanic system, which scientists had long monitored as a potential supervolcano, erupted with apocalyptic fury. The explosion was so massive that it blocked out the sun across vast regions of the country, covering everything in a thick blanket of ash that made normal life impossible. I watched as the New Madrid Fault system in the central United States, an area I had studied extensively, began to move with violence that dwarfed even the famous earthquakes of the early 1800s. The Mississippi River changed course dramatically, creating new lakes and destroying cities that had stood for generations. Memphis, St. Louis, and other major population centers simply disappeared as the ground beneath them shifted and cracked. The eastern seaboard faced its own catastrophic challenges as a massive tsunami generated by an underwater earthquake off the Atlantic coast swept inland with devastating power. I watched in horror as New York City, Miami, and other coastal metropolises were overwhelmed by walls of water that reached heights I had never thought possible. "See how the proud cities fall," Jesus said, his voice heavy with both justice and grief. "These centers of commerce and power where my name has been mocked and my laws rejected will be brought low by the very earth they thought they could exploit without consequence." But then something remarkable happened in my vision. As the destruction spread across the continent, I began to see areas that remained untouched by the chaos. 4 distinct regions stood out like islands of stability in an ocean of geological upheaval. These areas were clearly defined as if invisible barriers protected them from the seismic violence surrounding them. The first protected region was centered in eastern Montana and extended into parts of North Dakota and northern Wyoming. I could see that the geological formations in this area, which I recognized from my studies, remained completely stable despite the massive earthquakes occurring all around them. It was as if the very rocks themselves were being held in place by an unseen hand. The second safe zone encompassed portions of Missouri, Arkansas, and southern Illinois. This surprised me because this region was actually crossed by the New Madrid Fault system, which was experiencing unprecedented activity. Yet within this specific area, the ground remained solid and unshaken, while destruction raged just miles away. The third protected region covered parts of eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and western North Carolina. The Appalachian Mountains in this area stood firm like ancient guardians, their roots running deep into the earth's crust, anchored by divine intervention against the forces trying to shake them loose. The fourth and final safe zone included portions of northern Maine and extended slightly into New Hampshire. This region, with its granite bedrock and ancient geological stability, remained completely unaffected by the seismic catastrophes devastating the rest of the continent. These 4 regions, Jesus explained, will be preserved as refuge for my faithful people. The boundaries you see are not arbitrary. They have been established according to spiritual principles that transcend mere geological considerations. Those who have remained true to my word, who have not compromised with the spirit of this age, will find safety within these protected areas. I was amazed by the precision of what I was witnessing. The boundaries of these safe zones didn't follow state lines or county borders. Instead, they seemed to be drawn according to some higher principle that took into account both the spiritual condition of the inhabitants and the underlying geological characteristics of the landlord. I asked, how will people know to go to these places? How will they understand that these specific areas will be protected when the great shaking begins? Those who walk closely with me will hear my voice calling them to safety. Jesus replied, just as I warned Noah before the flood and led Lot out of Sodom before its destruction, I will provide guidance to those whose hearts are open to my spirit. Some will receive dreams and visions, Others will feel an unexplainable urge to relocate. Still others will be led by faithful servants like yourself who share what they have seen. The vision continued to unfold, showing me not just the physical destruction, but the spiritual significance behind it. I could see that the areas experiencing the most severe judgment were also the regions where moral decay had advanced furthest, cities that had officially rejected biblical values, states that had passed laws directly contradicting God's commandments, and regions where persecution of faithful believers had become commonplace were the ones suffering the most devastating consequences. But the protected areas were different. These were regions where substantial populations of genuine believers remained, where biblical principles still influenced local governance to some degree, and where the name of Jesus was still honored rather than mocked. The correlation between spiritual condition and physical preservation was unmistakable. This is not merely about geological forces. Jesus continued, this is about the spiritual battle for the soul of America. The nation that was founded on biblical principles and dedicated to my glory has strayed far from its original purpose, but I have not abandoned it completely. These 4 regions represent my remnant, the foundation upon which a renewed nation will be built after the shaking is complete. I realized that what I was witnessing was not just random destruction, but a divine winnowing process. The America that would emerge from this great shaking would be fundamentally different from the one I had known. It would be smaller geographically, but stronger spiritually, refined by judgment, impurified by tribulation. As I watched these 4 protected regions standing like beacons of hope amid the devastation, Jesus began to show me something even more profound. The vision shifted, and I could see into the spiritual realm overlaying the physical landscape. What I witnessed there took my breath away over the areas experiencing destruction. I saw massive dark clouds filled with demonic entities celebrating the chaos below. These weren't metaphorical representations, but actual spiritual beings reigning in the suffering and devastation. They moved like swarms of locusts, feeding off the fear and despair of the people trapped in the collapsing cities. Their presence was so thick over places like Las Vegas, Hollywood, and certain political centers that it almost blocked out the light entirely. But over the 4 protected regions, the spiritual atmosphere was completely different. Brilliant columns of light stretched from heaven to earth, and I could see countless angels standing guard at the boundaries of each safe zone. These weren't small cherub-like figures from children's books. They were massive, powerful warriors of heaven, their very presence causing the demonic forces to recoil in terror. The contrast was stunning. While darkness consumed most of the continent, these 4 areas blazed with divine protection. The angels weren't passive guardians either. I watched as they actively deflected seismic waves, redirected floodwaters, and even altered weather patterns to shield the people within their care. See how my army protects those who are mine, Jesus said, his voice filled with both tenderness and power. The same spiritual forces that destroyed Sodom while preserving Lot, that brought judgment on Egypt while protecting the Israelites in Gan, are at work today. My angels have been positioned strategically across these regions, and no force of hell or earth can penetrate their defense. The vision continued, and I began to see the timeline of these events more clearly. The great shaking would not happen all at once, but would unfold over a period of approximately 18 months, beginning in early 2026. The first major event would be the California mega earthquake, followed by the Yellowstone eruption about 4 months later. The New Madrid fault activation would come next, and finally, the eastern seaboard tsunami would complete the cycle of judgment. But I also saw something that filled me with both hope and urgency. In the months before these events began, there would be a period of supernatural warning signs. Unusual animal behavior, strange atmospheric phenomena, and unexplained geological anomalies would serve as divine alerts for those who knew how to interpret them. More importantly, there would be an unprecedented outpouring of prophetic dreams and visions among believers. My people will not be caught off guard, Jesus assured me. Just as I warned Joseph of the coming famine in Egypt, just as I revealed to Daniel the rise and fall of kingdoms, I am already beginning to speak to my faithful servants about what is approaching. Some are receiving these revelations even as we speak, though many do not yet understand their full significance. The vision expanded to show me individuals across the country who were already experiencing supernatural encounters. I saw a farmer in Nebraska waking from vivid dreams about massive earthquakes. A pastor in Georgia was receiving repeated visions of great floods. A teacher in Montana kept having the same recurring dream about her family moving to a specific location that she had never visited but somehow knew was safe. These are my early warning system. Jesus explained, the spiritual gifts that have been dormant in many of my people are being activated because of the urgent times ahead. Those who have been faithful in small things are being entrusted with greater revelations because lives depend on their obedience to what I am showing them. I watched as the timeline continued to unfold, seeing how the great shaking would serve multiple purposes beyond judgment. The collapse of the current economic system would force people to return to simpler ways of living and to depend on community rather than technology. The destruction of entertainment centers and corrupt institutions would remove many of the distractions that had kept people from seeking God. Most importantly, the dramatic nature of these events would serve as an undeniable sign that the God of the Bible was real and active in human affairs. In the aftermath of the destruction, I saw a great spiritual awakening beginning to spread across the 4 protected regions. People who had been nominal Christians their entire lives suddenly understood the reality of God's power and judgment. Those who had been seeking truth but couldn't find it amid the noise and confusion of modern society suddenly encountered the living Christ in unmistakable ways. Churches in the safe zones began to overflow with new converts, not because of clever marketing or entertaining programs, but because the presence of God was so tangible that no one could deny it. I watched as denominational barriers dissolved and believers united around the essential truths of the gospel. The petty disputes and theological arguments that had divided the church for generations seemed insignificant in light of the dramatic times they were living through. But perhaps most remarkably, I saw how the protected regions began to function as beacons of hope for the rest of the world. News of areas that had been supernaturally preserved while everything around them was destroyed spread rapidly across international media. Scientists would be unable to explain why these specific locations remained stable, while regions with supposedly stronger geological foundations collapsed. The world will be forced to acknowledge that something beyond natural forces is at work. Jesus told me the precision of the preservation, the clear boundaries between destruction and safety. The correlation between spiritual condition and physical protection will serve as an undeniable testimony to my sovereignty over the affairs of men. As the vision continued, I saw representatives from other nations coming to these protected areas, seeking to understand the secret of their preservation. Some came as skeptics, trying to find scientific explanations for what had occurred. Others came as desperate seekers, recognizing that only divine intervention could account for what they were witnessing. The leaders of the remnant communities in these regions would find themselves in positions of unexpected influence. Their testimony about God's protection and provision would carry weight because it was backed up by undeniable evidence. The gospel would spread from these safe zones like ripples from stones dropped in still water, reaching far beyond the borders of America itself. I was shown how the agricultural regions within the protected zones would become incredibly productive, yielding harvests that defied natural explanation. While much of the world struggled with food shortages caused by the widespread destruction, these areas would not only feed their own populations, but would have surplus to share with others. This abundance would serve as another powerful testimony to God's blessing on those who remained faithful to Him. The vision revealed that within these 4 regions, new forms of governance would emerge based on biblical principles rather than secular humanism. Leaders would be chosen for their character and wisdom rather than their political connections or wealth. Justice would be administered fairly, and the vulnerable would be protected and cared for by the community as a whole. But I also saw the challenges that the survivors would face. The destruction of the national infrastructure would mean that the protected regions would initially be largely cut off from each other and from the outside world. They would need to become self-sufficient quickly, relying on their own resources and the supernatural provision that God would provide. The people in these areas would need to learn skills that previous generations had taken for granted: growing food, preserving it without modern technology, building and maintaining structures without access to large supply chains, and caring for the sick without fully equipped hospitals would all become necessary abilities for survival. Yet, I saw that these challenges would actually strengthen the communities rather than weaken them. People would rediscover the value of hard work, mutual dependence, and simple living. Families would grow closer as they worked together for survival. Neighbors would form bonds that went far deeper than the superficial relationships that had characterized suburban life in the previous era. The vision showed me that this would not be a temporary period of hardship followed by a return to the old ways. The America that emerged from the Great Shaking would be permanently transformed. The 4 protected regions would become the foundation stones of a renewed nation, one that acknowledged God's sovereignty and sought to align its laws and culture with biblical principles. Children born in these communities would grow up with a completely different world view than their parents had possessed. They would understand from an early age that God was real, that His judgments were righteous, and that obedience to His word was not optional, but essential for both individual and collective survival. As the vision began to draw to a close, Jesus turned to me with an expression of such love and urgency that it penetrated every part of my being. "Amanda," he said, "the time for these events to begin is very short. The geological signs that you have studied throughout your career are already indicating the buildup of pressure that will soon be released. Your scientific training will help people understand that what they are about to witness is not random disaster but purposeful judgment. You must tell them that there is still time to prepare, both spiritually and physically. Those who have been lukewarm in their faith must choose to follow me wholeheartedly. Those who have been living in open rebellion against my word must repent and turn to me before it is too late. And those who are already walking with me must be ready to help others find their way to safety when the shaking begins. The message you carry is not one of hopelessness, but of hope. Yes, judgment is coming, but so is redemption. Yes, the old order is passing away, but something beautiful and pure is being born in its place. The 4 protected regions I have shown you are not just refugees from physical destruction, but birthing places for spiritual renewal. Tell them also that the timing of these events is in my hands, not in the calculations of seismologists or the predictions of doomsday prophets. When the first major earthquake strikes California, they will know that everything you have shared is true, and they will have a brief window of time to respond before the full sequence of events unfolds. As Jesus spoke these final words, I felt myself being drawn back toward my physical body. The brilliant light began to fade, and the spiritual realm started to give way to earthly reality. But His voice continued to echo in my consciousness as I made the transition back to life. Remember everything you have seen, He said. Share it faithfully regardless of whether people believe you or mock you. Your testimony will plant seeds of truth that will grow in the hearts that are prepared to receive them. Some will act on this warning and find safety. Others will dismiss it and face the consequences of their choice. But you will have been faithful to deliver the message I have given you. The pulling sensation grew stronger, and I could feel myself approaching the boundary between the spiritual and physical realms. The last thing I remember seeing was Jesus' face filled with both infinite love and absolute determination. Then suddenly, I gasped and opened my eyes to find myself surrounded by emergency responders who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. I had been unconscious for 17 minutes when the paramedics finally extracted me from beneath the massive boulder that had crushed the front half of my vehicle. Later, the medical team would tell me that my injuries should have been fatal: multiple skull fractures, severe internal bleeding, and complete cardiac arrest for over 15 minutes. They called it a miracle that I survived, but I knew the truth. I hadn't just survived. I had died, traveled to realms beyond human comprehension, and been sent back with a message that could save countless lives. The moment I returned to consciousness, every detail of the vision remained crystal clear in my mind. The scientific part of my brain wanted to analyze and categorize what I had experienced. But the spiritual reality of what I had witnessed transcended any framework that geology or physics could provide. I had been given a divine map of America's future, and the responsibility of sharing this revelation weighed on my soul like nothing I had ever experienced. As I lay in that hospital bed, still connected to machines monitoring my vital signs, I couldn't stop thinking about the precision of what Jesus had shown me. The 4 protected regions weren't randomly scattered across the continent. They formed a pattern that spoke to both God's judgment and His mercy. Each area represented a different aspect of His character and His plan for the remnant that would survive the coming shaking. The eastern Montana region, with its vast agricultural potential and sparse population, would serve as America's breadbasket during the Reconstruction period. The Missouri, Arkansas, and Illinois corridor would become a center for governance and leadership, where godly men and women would establish new forms of government based on biblical principles. The Appalachian Zone, covering parts of Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina, would function as a stronghold of faith where the spiritual foundations of the renewed nation would be laid. And the northern Maine area would serve as a gateway for international relations, welcoming representatives from other nations who came seeking to understand the source of America's supernatural preservation. But what struck me most profoundly was the realization that these events weren't distant possibilities. The timeline Jesus had revealed to me placed the beginning of the Great Shaking in early 2026, barely 3 months away from the date of my vision. The geological signs I had been studying throughout my career suddenly took on new meaning. The unusual seismic activity we had been detecting wasn't just random tectonic movement. It was the Earth itself preparing for divine intervention on a scale that would reshape the entire continent. I thought about my colleagues at the United States Geological Survey, brilliant scientists who could calculate earthquake probabilities and analyze fault systems with incredible precision, but who had no framework for understanding supernatural intervention in geological processes. How could I explain to them that the data we had been collecting pointed not just to natural disasters, but to acts of divine judgment that would unfold with mathematical precision? The vision had shown me that the coming destruction wouldn't be random or chaotic. Every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every shift in the ground would serve a specific purpose in God's plan to purge America of the wickedness that had taken root in its major population centers and to preserve a righteous remnant for the rebuilding that would follow. I understood now why Jesus had chosen a geologist to receive this revelation. My scientific background would help people comprehend the magnitude of what was coming while my new spiritual understanding would enable me to explain the divine purposes behind these catastrophic events. The combination of geological knowledge and prophetic insight would make the message impossible to dismiss as mere religious fanaticism. As I contemplated the 4 protected regions, I realized that each one already contained significant populations of genuine believers who had been faithfully praying for revival and spiritual awakening in America. These weren't necessarily the most prominent or visible Christian communities, but they were the ones where authentic faith still flourished. God had been preparing these areas for decades, positioning his faithful servants in strategic locations where they could provide leadership during the coming crisis. The vision had also revealed something crucial about timing. While the major seismic events would begin in early 2026, the period of supernatural warnings would start much sooner. In fact, I realized that my own experience was part of this early warning system. People across the country would begin receiving dreams, visions, and prophetic revelations about the coming shaking. Those who were spiritually discerning would recognize these signs and begin making preparations, both spiritual and physical. I thought about the practical implications of what I had seen. Families living in the areas destined for destruction would need to make difficult decisions about relocating to the protected regions. This wouldn't be easy, especially for those with established careers, deep community roots, and significant financial investments in their current locations. But the alternative would be facing the full force of God's judgment without any supernatural protection. The vision had shown me that the transition wouldn't be instantaneous. There would be a window of time between the initial warnings and the full manifestation of the great shaking. During this period, those who heeded the prophetic warnings would have the opportunity to relocate to the safe zones and begin establishing the communities that would serve as the foundation for America's spiritual renewal. I understood that my role wasn't just to warn people about coming destruction, but to help them understand the redemptive purpose behind these events. The America that would emerge from the Great Shaking would be smaller geographically, but infinitely stronger spiritually. The remnant communities in the 4 protected regions would become beacons of hope for the entire world, demonstrating what human society could look like when it was truly aligned with God's principles. As I lay there processing everything I had witnessed, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Jesus had entrusted me with information that could literally mean the difference between life and death for millions of people. Some would hear the message and respond with faith, making the necessary preparations and finding safety in the protected regions. Others would dismiss it as the delusions of a traumatized woman who had suffered a severe head injury. That was 3 days ago, and I haven't been able to sleep peacefully since returning to my body. Every time I close my eyes, I see those 4 protected regions standing like islands of hope in an ocean of destruction. The vision burns in my mind with such clarity that I know beyond any doubt it came from the throne of God Himself. I'm sharing this testimony not because I want to frighten anyone, but because Jesus commanded me to warn His people while there's still time to prepare. The Great Shaking is coming to America, but His mercy has provided refuge for those who will listen to His voice and respond in faith. Time is running shorter than anyone realizes, and the choice before each of us is eternal. Thank you for walking with us all the way to this final moment. If you're still watching, it's because something in this message resonated deeply within you. Now, we ask you to take one simple action that can ripple far beyond what you imagine. Write a comment and let us know the place you're watching from. We want to lift your nation in prayer. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the messages and revelations we release every day. And please pass this video on to at least 3 people you care about, friends, relatives, or fellow believers. A single share can reach a heart that's searching, restore faith, and draw a soul back toward God. May the Lord cover you with His blessing and guide you in His light now and always.